All right, Ramblers, let's ramble. We've got a great treat, special treat for you today. We have Dr. Vinay Prasad. I hope I said that correctly. Professor of Epidemiology and Biostats, University of California, San Francisco. Two books, Malignant and Ending Medical Reversal. So I've already suggested that to some students. You guys should check that out. So first things first, how are you? How you feeling? You're obviously really, really busy. How's everything going out there in California?
I'm doing well. Things are good. It's just we're winding down here. It's May 14th, and I'm busy. I'm on service in the hospital. I teach some classes. It's the spring class season here. I'm doing some epidemiology teaching and getting ready for the summertime. So gonna do a little bit more research then.
Awesome. And that's a perfect segue. So let's say a college student comes up to you, Dr. Prasad. So look, I'm hearing different things. I'm healthy. I'm a college student. I want to play. I'm an athlete. I play sports. I haven't had any illnesses like most people in my demographic. But my doctor and people are pressuring me to get more boosters. What do you think, doctor? What should I do? What does the science say?
Well, I think thankfully fewer and fewer people are asking that now because the uptake of boosters in the younger people has really bottomed out. I think people have learned that they're not going to be deriving a lot of benefit. But here's what I'd say about the science for that. I think when we're talking about young people, especially men between the ages of 16 and 26, I think it's easy to show that the first booster was net harmful. That's a paper that Kevin Bardosh and I did about booster mandates. The first booster, so the third dose, because it has a risk of myocarditis that's greater than the potential reduction in hospitalization. But that was back then. Now it's 2024. We're talking about anyone who's been up to date on their boosters might have been getting as many as 5 or 6 or 7 shots. And they probably already had COVID once, perhaps twice. So what's the probability an additional dose is going to benefit them? I think absolutely as close to 0 as you can get. What's the probability they're harmed? That's a real probability, probably bigger than the probability of benefit. And then the final question they may be asking is, well, what if I'm going to see grandma next week? What if I'm going to see somebody vulnerable? Well, unfortunately, boosters don't halt transmission. There may be a transient reduction in your ability to transmit, but that's very small and it doesn't last very long. So to me, and also grandma's probably already had COVID at this point as well. So you put all that together, to me, the proposition of additional doses is extremely problematic. There are not many countries that recommend young people keep getting dose after dose. A lot of the European countries have moved away from that. America is still a place where we're maximizing the interests of the pharmaceutical industry, so we keep pushing it.
So would you say that, the United States for sure, but us as well, because our policies were almost identical to yours. Would you say that when you look around the world that we got it wrong more than most other countries, especially in the West?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that, you're in Canada, just so the listeners will know. Yeah. So, in Canada and the United States, particularly, we got, most of the policy decisions wrong. Probably the places that did best were the Northern European countries, Sweden in particular, but also Denmark, also the Central European countries like Switzerland. How did we get it wrong? We got everything wrong, from school closure to vaccine mandates to lockdown, prolonged lockdown, to Paxlovid in young populations, to dose after dose after dose. We can get into all the ways we got it wrong.
Yeah, and I'm just looked at, I thought, let's see what the CDC, the current CDC is saying. So I looked this up. It says your children aged 6 months to 4 years should, this is according to the Center for Disease Control, should get 1 dose of an updated COVID-19 vaccine to protect against serious illness. Children aged 6 months to 4 years they need multiple doses of COVID-19 vaccines to be up to date. 6 months to 4 years. So if somebody comes up to you and says, or you have a friend that just had a baby, they're 6 months old and you're going to give them this vaccine? Is that as insane as it sounds, or am I just being crazy here?
Well, I share your view in a number of ways. One is that they never had good data for that age group, even in the outset. I think people forget the history. We basically did a randomized control trial in adult population, Pfizer and Moderna did, and then the way the FDA expanded the approval for this vaccine was something called immunobridging. Basically, you show that younger populations have a similar level, what we call non-inferior, a similar level of antibodies generated by the vaccine. They were able to do that down to 12, then they were able to do that down to 5. But then we talk about from 6 months to 5 years old, those clinical trials struggled. They failed to achieve non-inferior antibodies, and they had to have some protocol amendments where they added a third dose, etc. And it came to the FDA. There was a strong push to try to get those vaccine products approved because there's a small group of parents who really wanted that vaccine. They had been inculcated into fear. But we never had clinical trial evidence that showed that those younger populations benefit from those doses even a couple years ago. We certainly don't have clinical trial evidence that they benefit from those doses going forward in 2024. So to me, it is as crazy as it sounds. We were talking about back then about antibodies generated in mice. We were talking about non-inferior antibody titers. We're not talking about are kids better off by getting this vaccine or not. We're still not talking about that. The last thing I'll say, I was a strong critic of the CDC adding COVID-19 vaccination to routine childhood immunization. I worried that the result of that would be that rather than increasing the uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine, which is what they wanted, they would get many people to throw away all of the routine childhood immunizations, and that's exactly what's happened. The uptake of all routine childhood immunizations is rock bottom because they got greedy and they tried to recommend vaccines that just didn't have a strong scientific basis, and that's the example. That's right.
Yeah, and what they don't, well, maybe they don't realize or they're just ignorant, is when they lie about something, is they're just going to make it more difficult. So in the case of other vaccines, like you just said, now people are going to say, well, once they hear the V word, they're going to despise all vaccines now. And let's say there is something that is more like the plague, that's like the movie Contagion, right? Which is what they were fearing us into. Let's say that does happen 5 years, 10 years from now. People are going to remember this and they're going to be more hesitant. And it makes sense that they're more hesitant.
Oh, absolutely agree with you. And I think that they've probably poisoned trust in expertise in public health for a generation. So I would say probably 50 years, where 50 years, anything happens, no one is ever going to trust them again. And there's going to be a strong political division on any policy, whether that's something that's actually very, very bad and we need to act upon, or whether it's something that actually largely is a concern for the elderly. No matter what it is, I think no one's going to trust the CDC going forward because they got too many things wrong.
Got too many things wrong. Let's talk about masking for a second. So
Sure.
I did see some things where they talked about how children have been impacted reading, vocabulary skills, but I don't really see, other than anecdotal, what I see in my classroom, differences in the way the students are and just the way they behave, willing to put up their hands, willing to lead, just willing to ask a question. Is there any evidence as to what the lockdowns did to the college age group?
And that's a good question. I mean, I think we talked about
most of them, I mean, a lot of them were 16 and 15 and 14 when it started, right? So they were in high school, but sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think, well, one is it's difficult to sort of tease out the causality of these things. How much of it was the lockdown? How much of it was growing up during the COVID-19 years? And how much of it is just sort of secular trends and anxiety and depression? But we do know, I think, that young people are suffering from a crisis of increased rates of anxiety, depression, particularly girls, particularly teen suicide is up. How much of that is attributable to these things? It's hard to know. I think anecdotally, many of us know some people who seem to do very poorly by having their teenage years robbed of them. I also hear people tell me anecdotally that their child may have thrived under those circumstances. You hear those too. But I think what's important to remember is whether or not did the sacrifice of young people by putting their life on pause for multiple years actually help anyone else? And that to me is the open question. So there is no strong evidence that I think that school closure changed the transmission dynamics in communities dramatically. There's a number of economic analyses that show little change. The New York Times is finally coming to terms with the fact that school closures for elementary school kids, middle school kids are extremely problematic. High school and college, I think, also needs to be assessed. Whether or not we did any good by keeping college kids at home. One thing we did do is we have an entirely new culture around work from home and Zoom. And it's nice to hear that you folks in Canada, you don't think it affects your students that much. But I think in the United States, our students are very different. I mean, everyone is Zooming into lectures. Nobody's coming. Participation is very low. and I think people are largely disinterested in the curriculum.
Yeah, some of my colleagues and I have been discussing it, and there was already a push for more online learning even before COVID. And I think when COVID basically put it into overdrive, I'm not liking it. I'm not like seeing what I'm seeing. My students are saying the only ones that are really liking it are the ones that just can't get to school anyways. They're the ones who have jobs, which is great because that opportunity is there for them to take online courses. But for everyone to go online, I mean, I share your concerns. You were talking about maybe all of these narratives being pushed by big pharma. Early on, did you have to kind of watch what you were saying because you didn't want to get booted off YouTube? I want to just get into censorship a little bit here. Did you get any strikes against you? Before we go any further, just want to say, of course, that the vaccine is the best thing that's ever happened. It's saved humanity. It'll cure baldness. It's the best thing ever, just so YouTube doesn't kick us off. Did you ever get strikes? Did you get warnings?
So one thing is that, you're right about the pharmaceutical conflict, but also we can't forget that some of the strongest articles in favor of lockdown were written by consultants for the educational industry, the online education industry. They also benefit. Lots of companies that benefit from keeping you at home, including big tech. So that was one thing. I think that we would not have had the particular policy response had this occurred in 1999 rather than 2019 because of the rise of technology and the ability to keep people at home and still turn a profit. Now, in terms of censorship, I would say that I've been pretty lucky. I'm also a very careful speaker, so I try not to, go beyond what the evidence shows. And I've been lucky to not have had many things censored. But let me talk about that. I don't think I've had any videos taken down. I think, like many people, I've had videos demonetized, like that nobody could put advertisements on them because it was deemed too provocative. But luckily, none were taken down. I never had any tweets that were taken down, but I worry that many of my tweets were dethrottled. In other words, that they weren't shown to as many people as they otherwise would have been had they been having the canonical right message. One thing I would say, though, is that there is active censorship and then there's passive censorship. So, active censorship is when you explicitly tell someone you can't say this or take down their posts. To me, passive censorship, passive academic freedom violations are when universities abdicate their role as a forum for debate and host literally zero debate. So I'll give you some examples. My university, University of California, San Francisco, not even my university, let's lump in Stanford, Johns Hopkins, Harvard. To my knowledge, they did not have a single debate on prolonged school closure for elementary school kids. San Francisco closed the schools for 18 months. At the university, we did not debate whether or not that was a sensible policy. The CDC recommended, and it was mandated in California, that children as young as 2 years old had to wear a cloth mask in daycare for the entire time in daycare except the 2 hours when they were napping. So like 10 hours they're wearing it, but 2 hours they nap, they all lay side by side. Okay, that policy was never debated in the epidemiology department, for instance. What does it say about a university where you cannot debate the most impactful, controversial public policy decisions that are being made? That to me is the greatest violation of academic freedom and is a form of censorship where people are too scared to even let people talk. And one of the things that I'm very worried about is there are definitely some commenters on COVID-19 who I think say things that go too far, that are incorrect, that are exaggerations. Their criticism of the vaccine is not targeted, it's too much, and it actually goes beyond what's true. Now, many people point at them and say, look at all the things they're getting wrong. And I'm critical that they're getting things wrong, but to me the failure is that, well, the universities did not want to actually have debates, so that pushes debates naturally to all these other fora, and naturally people are going to take it too far. If you wanted to have a range of reasonable debate, we would have had at the university. We didn't. So my thoughts on censorship, we can get some examples, but Jay Bhattacharya and Iran Ben David at Stanford were told by their boss that we don't want you talking about this topic. That to me is that boss has been promoted to the dean of Cornell Medical School, Bob Harrington. So, the people who engage in censorship are promoted. I think in the litigation against Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, it's abundantly clear that the federal government colluded with big tech to silence Twitter accounts like Martin Kulsdorff and Jay. I think that is a First Amendment violation. We'll see what the Supreme Court says. To me, censorship is a huge problem. And the last thing, Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci famously did not want to debate the Great Barrington Declaration, which was a proposal to have a COVID-19 response that was more proportionate to the risk at different age groups. They didn't want to have that discussion because they favored a one-size-fits-all policy. I think these examples where people were unwilling to debate is a huge threat to science, to freedom, and also should not, people say it's bad that we've lost trust in experts. I think some of that loss of trust is well-deserved.
Absolutely, because the evidence is there. And it's funny because we're talking about Dr. Jay Bhattacharya in Dr. Collins basically, and Dr. Fauci said there's these fringe epidemiologists. We need to smack these guys down instead of having debate. So masking was another thing, right? It's funny that people are now starting to talk about masks like, yeah, masks are a joke. But just the other day, and I think you addressed this in a recent video, they're actually talking about permanent masking. Didn't the Cochrane study, how good was that study in showing that the masking really didn't work, or whatever benefit there was so little that it was probably more harm than good?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess one thing I want to say when we talk about masking is I want to draw a distinction between, masking means many, many things, but here we're talking about the biggest thing people talk about. So, one thing masking may mean is if I see a tuberculosis patient who's coughing up blood, should I wear a tight-fitting N95 when I go in the room for 4 minutes? That's one question. But that's not the public policy question that we faced in this moment. The question was, should there be a universal or community-level mask mandate requirement? In other words, when you go into the grocery store, if you're walking through the hospital gift shop, if you're in the mall, should you be compelled to wear a mask? The next part of that policy, so we're talking about everybody in everyday life. The next part of that policy is what kind of mask were you compelled to wear? In the United States, during the majority of the mask mandates, the mask we were compelling people to wear was a cloth mask. Not only was the pre-pandemic body of literature showed that those do not work, all of the evidence that accrued during the pandemic showed over and over those do not work. Finally, it was conceded that they do not work, cloth masks don't work, and then they switched over to surgical mask mandates. Then people started to ask the question, well, do mask mandates actually slow the spread of respiratory virus? And the answer is, I think from most epidemiology studies, and even Anthony Fauci himself has conceded that mask mandates likely don't work in the community. The Cochrane Review is a meta-analysis of community mask studies where people are encouraged and extolled to wear masks, and it largely shows no benefit. I think it shows no benefit, period. Some people say that, well, if you ran the studies even bigger and for longer, you might find a benefit. It's possible, but the burden is on them to do so. That to me is a problem. Another problem is that even though this was the most contentious topic, the United States made 0 attempts to run studies on the topic. Anthony Fauci was saying we should do this. He controls the research budget. He ran 0 randomized trials of masking. Now, fast forward to today.
And you were calling for those, by the way, on your show. You were saying, I think 2.5 years ago, you were saying it. You were saying, we can do this right now.
Yeah, I was saying that from, I think, the summer of 2020, alongside some British investigators. And there was talks to try to do it, but I think they were sabotaged by true believers. The last thing I'd say is, you talk about perpetual masking. This is the piece I wrote. My hospital has implemented a new policy where 6 months a year, everybody in that hospital, whether you're not in the gift shop, the cafeteria, walking through the halls, you got to wear the mask from November 1st to April 30th. To me, that's crazy. Why? Does the mask not work on Halloween, but it works on Thanksgiving? So the one question is, why you pick those dates? The next question is there any evidence that this policy actually slows spread of iatrogenic infection or in the community? And there's just no evidence. And then the third thing is, well, why don't you do a cluster randomized trial? So maybe for your listeners who are college students, let me give some background. In medicine, when we have a policy, we don't know for sure whether or not it works. We do a study called a cluster randomized trial, where basically we say, okay, we don't know whether or not making people wear a mask is going to slow the spread of the virus. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 57 hospitals and randomize you to doing it, and another 57 hospitals will randomize you to not doing it. And then we're going to measure people on the way in, on the way out. We'll count the cases, and we'll say, did the 57 hospitals that we randomized have less spread than those that didn't? Okay, we've done this for many other things like rapid response teams, for wearing a gown and gloves in the intensive care unit. We've run cluster randomized trials. we could do the same thing for this question, and we could get the answer by the end of one winter season. Unfortunately, there is a strong political pressure not to get that answer because they've already decided they know the answer, which is to do it. And that to me is an anti-science point of view. And that to me is the most dangerous type of misinformation out there, the misinformation that we can't, advance knowledge.
Yeah, and when you talk about people not, and you did a recent talk recently about trust in science, there's that, right? There's the research part of it. There's that, what you do at the universities, what's done in the labs. But what I'm hearing now is that people don't trust their family doctors anymore because their family doctors basically just said, well, I'm told you got to take a booster, so take a booster. Or if you want to play sports, here it is. They didn't tell them whether or not there's any adverse events. And now people don't trust healthcare as opposed to not trusting science. Are you seeing some of that, or
Yes.
am I being alarmist there too? Okay.
No, I think you're correct. I mean, I think that on the one
I haven't
hand,
been a
though,
doctor in 3 years, and in Canada, a lot of people actually don't have family doctors.
I see.
So they actually have to go to Emerge when they want to go to a family doctor.
I mean, on the one hand, part of me wants to say that that loss of trust is unjustified, but part of me wants to say that, I don't know, if you were a pediatrician and you looked someone in the eye and you said, your 2-year-old should really wear that cloth mask in daycare, well, honestly, I wouldn't trust you ever again either, because I think you've forfeited something great in my mind, which was you showed that when you were scared and afraid, you blindly deferred to authority and you didn't use your own common sense. To me, that's just a great example, because I have a friend in Switzerland and he's an expert in evidence-based medicine. And he says that obviously they never masked 2-year-olds in Europe. Actually the European CDC said never to do it under the age of 6. So Europe was always a little bit better than we were. We can debate whether or not it works for 6 to 12 and 12 to 8. We could debate that, but it's certainly Europe was not so crazy as to go under 6. Okay. He says that the Americans are so crazy. They're masking the 2-year-old. He says, you don't even need to go to school to know that that doesn't work. You just need eyes. You just need to watch them chewing the mask and sucking on it and putting things in their mouth. Just need eyes for 15 minutes. You'll know that's not going to do anything. And yet, when a pediatrician told a parent to do that, when the American Academy of Pediatrics said you ought to do that, said you may be concerned babies need to see faces, there's no reason to have that concern. When the CDC said you ought to do that, they lost trust. And what I want to say is that they should. I mean, of course you should lose trust. You've shown that you don't have basic common sense. And I no longer trust those agencies. I like to look at things myself. And if I had a doctor that told me to get a booster after I'd had and recovered from COVID-19, I might not trust that doctor anymore, because I don't think they're reading the literature the way they ought to be.
And a lot of their excuses, their reasoning, their rationale, they just sounded hokey. For anybody, like, you don't even have to have a degree in science, degree in medicine, but some of the things they said just didn't sound right. Like, they would say, well, you have to get this so that you don't get the virus. It's like, well, I have natural immunity, and what if I don't care? Well, then you have to take it so that grandmother doesn't get it.
But the problem with
there
that
was
is
no evidence about that with that.
Right.
But they just say it. So I want to just talk about the human element for a second. Did it frustrate you? Did it anger you that in order to question anything, in order to be skeptical, you need all of this evidence? However, you need such flimsy, tiny little evidence to get everybody to mask, to get everybody to get vaccinated, to lock everybody down. All these evidence, all these things that you've been talking about, they just seem so spurious and weak.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So I would say, how did they become this way? One thought about it is that in the years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were good vaccines that we wanted people to take, and very rarely we would encounter somebody who didn't want their child to get the MMR vaccine. And for instance, and the more you probed that feeling, that why they don't want to, you often found that was on the basis of misconceptions about what MMR vaccine does, how transmissive measles is, what's the harm of measles. There are a lot of misconceptions. So doctors were trained in this world where when they encountered resistance to vaccination, their goal was to try to change that person's mind. Enter COVID-19 pandemic. I think just like you would not treat all drugs the same, you shouldn't treat all vaccines the same. Each drug that you take should be evaluated. Some work, some don't. Some are good, some have marginal benefits. You should evaluate every vaccine differently. But the same doctors approached it with that same paradigm, which was, it's got to be good, it's got to be great, just give shots in arms. They used to say that sort of stuff. To me, some of the problems are like, I'm a believer that older people who did not previously have COVID-19 did derive benefit in first quarter 2021 from vaccination. An 80-year-old who didn't have COVID-19 did derive benefit. And I know that because the randomized trial of Moderna shows an imbalance in severe disease of 30-1, a huge benefit in reduction in severe disease. So I believe that. But what I don't believe is that a 20-year-old man who had already had COVID twice derived any benefit from vaccination, because no randomized trial has ever shown that. So the ability to have judgment, to understand that risk goes up with age, not just linearly, but logarithmically, meaning that the risk to an 88-year-old is 10,000 times greater than an 8-year-old, not 10 times greater, it's 10,000 times greater. And then natural immunity lowers the risk of severe disease, even though it doesn't prevent you from getting infected again. To have these two principles, and then to think, well, where might vaccination have a net benefit? So to your point, yes, the people who recommended vaccines did so in an indiscriminate way. They didn't target it, and they didn't express nuance and uncertainty when they ought to have, and that did backfire. Remember, some people said that once you get vaccinated, you can never get the virus. Of course, that was not true by the summer of 2021. Those kinds of statements were irresponsible and led to the backlash. And then the final point, mandates. I want to draw a distinction between if somebody wants to do something, that's different than somebody mandating them to do it. The threshold to mandate something has got to be a lot higher than a person making an individual choice. If somebody wants to get, a booster every year, like going on into the future, I don't have a problem with that. That's their choice. That's their body. But I do have a problem when they start to tell me I have to do it too. So the threshold to mandate historically in biomedicine has been you have to prove beyond a doubt that the mandate benefits third parties so much so that it's worth taking away the individual autonomy. Not only did they never prove that with their mandates, at the time of the mandate, they had evidence that that was not the case, that people who were vaccinated will transmit later. So they knew when they did the mandate that it wasn't going to benefit third parties. It was scientifically unjustified, it was ethically unjustified, and it was a huge public health fiasco. And that's why they're eating so much crow today, I think.
They're eating crow, but nobody loses their job. Nobody gets publicly shamed. Anybody that pushed the public narrative basically has gone on to do, like, look at Rachel Maddow gets $35 million a year for one show a week. One show a week. What did she do? It can't be her ratings, because all the ratings on cable TV are horrible. I've seen you on some shows that get higher ratings than MSNBC or CNN. And on podcasts, I've seen you. So there has to, I wanted to lead to this question, because you were talking about Sweden, you were talking about some of the Scandinavian countries. So what is the difference in the systems between, let's say, the United States and Sweden? Why is it that they're able to say, well, hold on here, let's take a second look at this, whereas in the United States, the FDA basically pushed what Big Pharma wanted, the CDC did, but then also all of the mainstream media outlets, they did the same. The unions did the same. Your fellow coworkers did the same. What's different? Is it because you have a two-party system in the United States that everything is political? Like, why was it so different? Why were you not allowed to be skeptical in the United States?
So I do think that you make a strong point, which is that the people who are on the bad side of most policy decisions are winning awards like I've never seen. I mean, Peter Hotez is winning career awards. Fauci's winning career. So these people who got pretty much everything wrong, like for instance, Peter Hotez, he supported school closure. He wanted to mask children. He supported vaccine mandates. He's winning the awards. Okay, but here's the point I'll make. I remember very well 9/11 because I was in college during that day. And I remember well the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that were launched in the wake of 9/11. And even when those wars were launched and Colin Powell went in front of the United Nations and presented evidence of weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be, as incorrect as the idea that closing schools will help us in the coronavirus pandemic, when he presented that incorrect information, there was very little pushback, and broadly the public supported him. But in just a few years, that public sentiment shifted so dramatically that by 2008, you could not be a candidate who voted for the Iraq war and have a shot at the presidency. Similarly, this is a different time horizon, but it will shift. The pendulum will swing so far back. By that I mean, the people who promoted school closure, every week in the New York Times there's another article about how damning the consequences are to the kids, the lost years of life. it's going to get worse. I mean, they're going to lose the educational. They're going to lose on educational attainment. That's going to mean their lives will be shorter. There'll be more gun violence in this generation. There'll likely be more teen pregnancy, more crime. These are byproducts of educational closure. That's going to keep adding up. Meanwhile, the investigations into the origin of the virus and people's personal emails and things like that, that's going to keep coming out. And as time goes on, people will forget exactly, the fear that they had. And I suspect that in the next 3 years or 5 years, there will be that same reversal on these issues. And the people who promoted these incorrect policies will be thought of the same way as Colin Powell was, which is largely disgraced, and he sacrificed his credibility. So I do think that the narrative will be correct eventually. Now your question is...
I hope you're right. Yeah, I hope you're right. Go ahead, sorry.
And then your second part of your question was Sweden. Yeah. Okay, Sweden. Why did Sweden get it right? Sweden got it right because of Anders Tegnell. I mean, it doesn't take, and Johan Giesecke, it doesn't take many thoughtful people to stop a society from losing their minds, but it takes a few. And this country, we didn't have anybody. But in the other countries, they had two really good seasoned epidemiologists who realized that lockdowns were barbaric and never been tested in human history. They were thought to be antithetical to principles of public health. I mean, public health, what is public health? And I have a master's in public health from Hopkins. Public health was never supposed to be a field where you have the police state pepper spray and baton people to stay in their house. It's not a field where you weld the doors shut. It's a field where, when people face crisis, you provide them resources and opportunities to make safer and wiser choices. It was always an uplifting field, historically. In the pandemic, it became weaponized by the police state and weaponized by fear. And so I think public health has disgraced itself, except in Sweden, in a few places where they remembered what public health really is. So in my mind, I think that Sweden will be ultimately deeply vindicated. It has already been vindicated by, every single metric. And that's just going to get worse as time goes on.
Yeah, I mean, even California, you had the insanity. You had bulldozers go and put sand in skateboard parks. And when I saw that, like, telling somebody that is one thing, but when you actually see it, you wonder, what are people thinking there? What did all of this do? Because you also are big on looking at studies with regard to cancer. What's happened with regard to cancer testing rates? Good news, bad news there over the last couple of years? I'm sure it's going to be bad news, but I'll let you spoil it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're getting at, like, what are the damages of lockdowns?
Yeah.
I think that, one thing that makes it very complicated is that many cancer screening tests were, I think, and I still think, they're used too broadly. They're used in low-risk populations, even where there's no net benefit. So if you stop a cancer screening test that's misused in the first place, you might actually make people better off, right? So that's sort of the double negative there. We do see that, but we do see an uptick in sort of advanced cancer diagnoses in people who have been sick. It's very difficult, I think, to tease out how much is attributable to lockdown or not. To me, the stronger case is just to point out that I don't think lockdown even accomplished the stated goals and had a massive economic consequence. And very likely, we do see probably the strongest evidence comes from heart disease, how many people who had heart attacks and stayed home and suffer the sequela of that. But we shall see with cancer.
Yeah, I mean, cancer is just one thing. It's like you said, there's certain, one thing that I've been following just because I'm getting older, where the efficacy of, not prostate, the other one, the test every 5 years, the colonoscopy.
Sure. So
I had been wondering for years, some people were saying, oh, it's a waste of time, don't do it. And some people say, no, get it done every 5 years. So was that something that was efficacious?
Well, it's funny you say that. We have a study called Nordic, which is a randomized trial of colonoscopy. So far, it's failed to show a reduction in colorectal cancer mortality. People think it needs a little more time. I think, personally, that colonoscopy is probably going to win that. It's pretty good. FlexSig is one. And we did see a delay in colonoscopies, but that might be one where you can salvage it. You can come back a year later and sort of make up for lost ground. That's less of the case if somebody had crushing chest pain or something and stayed home. Less of the case if somebody had leukemia and didn't want to come to the hospital until too late. So I think those are the places you're going to see the damage more.
Okay. As the evolution of evidence started coming out over the last 3.5 years, what did you get wrong? What did you have to change your mind on?
That's a good question. So I would say that, again, I'm very cautious, and people can go and check. I have a pinned tweet of like all my policy positions, all the op-eds I wrote over the time. And I think I'm pretty happy with my overall track record, but there are some things I got wrong. Probably the biggest thing I got wrong was that I was too optimistic that the vaccines would slow and halt spread. I was clear. I never supported vaccine mandates. I never supported masking after vaccination. I thought masking had weak evidence before, and masking after vaccination made no sense at all to me. But I was optimistic that vaccines would dramatically slow transmission. They did for a while until escape variants emerged. So I think that's one thing that I got wrong. And I guess I'm grateful that I didn't embrace the stronger policy positions that would have been a consequence of that. So, I was wrong about the idea, but I don't think I was wrong about the policy.
What did you get right before everybody else did?
I would say...
What were you ahead of the curve on?
What was I ahead of the curve on? Number one, schools. I mean, I thought schools should reopen for elementary school kids within 6 weeks, and eventually everyone has come around to my point of view. Number two, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. The moment I heard they could cause blood clots in the brain, something called vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia and thrombosis, I tweeted that it should be withdrawn from market. It was game over. Ultimately, it was withdrawn, and Johnson & Johnson closed that entire branch of drug development. I think myocarditis, I was ahead of the curve. I was the first to recognize that even a safety signal of 1 in 3,000 that the Israelis were reporting in March of 2021 was enough that it was going to be harmful to young men. And in fact, that's become the case. Boosters, I think the FDA officials who were in charge of approving boosters resigned over that. The moment I saw that Marion Gruber and Phil Krause resigned, I thought that this yearly perpetual booster strategy in young populations was going to be wrong. Masking young kids. I think I wrote an article in The Atlantic in 2021 that didn't earn me many friends when I said it doesn't make sense to mask young kids. That's been vindicated. So I think I was vindicated on a lot. I would say that probably Jay Bhattacharya and Martin were vindicated on even more. I mean, they were quick to say lockdown would be a failed strategy. I think it was largely failed. And I think in many ways they were even more courageous than I was because they came out maybe 6 months before me.
Yeah, Jay really got it. He got death threats. He got it all, didn't he? Did you lose any friends?
It's funny because I think I lost some associates, but like my actual core group of friends, the same people I've known from like high school, college, residency, fellowship, I have like friends from each of these aspects of my life. They largely always agreed with me on all these issues. And I wonder what that is. It's like common sense plus the same sort of outlook about life. But, my high school friend who never went to college agrees with me. My friend who's a surgeon agreed with me. Among my actual core group of friends, we were largely like-minded on these policy issues, even though we do span the political spectrum. I have friends who are like, conservatives and friends who are, diehard liberals. To me, one of the disappointments was which is that I think many of the policy positions that harmed minorities and harmed poor people and harmed the young were policy positions embraced by the far left, who presume to be the group of people who are most in support of minorities, the poor, and the young. They took the positions that harmed them the most. And that, to me, is sort of the worst legacy of the pandemic.
Yeah, rich people, the laptop class, the professional class, they all made off like bandits. It's funny because how everybody had to get in on it. So you're talking about myocarditis. So early on, when it was a thing, they started putting out commercials. There was one, I don't know if you saw it, with a little girl going shopping, and she's talking about, I have an inflamed heart, but it's not a big deal. So instead of actually addressing the issue, they're basically saying, hey, don't worry about the adverse events, which was disgusting.
Can I say something on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Many of us, we pleaded with FDA and CDC to do several things. One, they needed to do a study of kids who got the dose and draw their troponin to look for subclinical myocarditis. In other words, how many people didn't have chest pain but still had heart damage? These companies, they failed repeatedly. I think Pfizer finally did theirs. Moderna still hasn't generated their data to show us that data. We had to wait for a study from Thailand to be the first estimate. And of course, it's, 100-fold higher than the actual complication. That's one. Two, we begged the FDA and the CDC, ask the company to test lower doses, space the doses further apart, omit doses in people who've had COVID-19, all to try to reduce the side effect. Like, in other words, there are other things they could do that is in between. Don't do anything and stop it altogether, right? They never tried. They never tried anything in between. And that to me speaks to such a fundamental failure at these agencies that they would not try for instance, lower doses. Would it kill them to try a randomized trial of lower doses? So those of us who follow drug safety, I think we're most upset that they were so utterly inflexible, they wouldn't consider anything other than, pursuing this reckless strategy.
Yeah, when you see that inflexibility, then of course it leads you to think all of this was for financial gain, because that is what they're leading you, right? Like when you say, what are colleagues, what are professionals saying when they say, hey, let's look at the evidence, and they say you can't look at it for 65 years or 55 years or 75 years, whatever it was that they wanted, the 70 years. And the government says, yeah, okay, we have no problem with that.
I mean, there's the old saying, don't attribute to malice that which can be attributed to stupidity.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean,
but in this case, I don't know.
Well, okay. So let's get into the malice. Let's get into stupidity. So the stupidity is, I think, that many of the people who hold these positions, they are smart in their own domain, but setting global policy without letting people debate you, setting global policy like this is something that nobody was really trained for. I mean, Anthony Fauci has a celebrated career. He's published a lot of important papers. But Anthony Fauci is not God, contrary to what he may think. And, and
he's
actually,
science, though.
Yeah, he's science, right. And actually, he got a lot of things wrong, and he was dishonest about some things, and he didn't want to hear from people who disagreed with him. And those are not good traits for somebody setting these kinds of policies. And maybe no one person should have the power to set these kinds of policies. That's another thing. So that's one. Two, I think that the agencies were ill-equipped for these kinds of challenges. Three, the profit motive. So, I mean, one is that, they're getting things wrong because they're just not really great at the job. Number two, the profit motive. I mean, of course, Pfizer made $100 billion from these products, from Paxlovid and the vaccines. Governments, Moderna, and, governments backed these products. People had a strong financial incentive to maximize the use of these products. An annual booster is going to make them a lot more money. These are age-old financial conflicts. Famously, I think there's a Canadian professor in Toronto who received money from the teachers' unions and then kept testifying about how schools were unsafe to reopen. There are conflicts like that. There are conflicts like Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General here, took money from Carnival Cruises and Airbnb and Netflix, and then he went to regulate those industries where famously, like, Netflix gets exemptions so they can keep filming content while everyone else is locked down, while the Surgeon General previously got conflicts of, got all these payments. These kinds of things, they look terrible. And I think a lot of that kind of graft did exist in the pandemic and did shape some of these bad policies.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be a bad thing. I mean, we're used to bad policies, right, from government. What we're not used to then is having social media platforms and mainstream media basically gaslighting you instead of them.
Right.
So that, and basically what I want to end on is finish up strong. I want to just give you a bunch of names and you tell me, hey, was this person an honest actor? Were they good? Were they bad? Did they get it right? Did they get it wrong? I like this part. So let's start with the obvious one that you just mentioned already. Dr. Fauci, at the end of this, what grade are you going to give him?
Oh, like D-F. So what did he get right? He spoke in complete sentences. What did he get wrong? I mean, he got masking wrong entirely. Not only, he somehow managed to get it wrong in a way that got it wrong for everybody. He originally said, don't do it, which was the right answer. Okay. Then he came back and said, do it, which was the dishonest answer. Then he said that I lied to you the first time when he really lied to you the second time. So, he was wrong on masking. He was wrong on schools. Governor Ron DeSantis wanted to reopen schools in the spring of 2020. Fauci went on TV to say how unsafe that was. 3, when Trump said in early July 2020 that schools should reopen in the fall, Fauci famously undermined him. That's schools. Lab leak, a number of emails that are coming out through this House committee investigation suggest that NIAID did fund the Wuhan laboratory and was engaged in gain-of-function research, and that might have been, we don't know for sure, but it might have been the origin of the virus. That's kind of a faux pas. Fauci was wrong about Great Barrington Declaration. He wanted to silence those actors. He was wrong about vaccine mandates, and he was wrong about vaccinating kids. So I think he was mostly wrong, in my opinion, wrong about Paxlovid, Wrong about remdesivir, which he pushed, a NIAID study. Mostly wrong. Okay, so that's it.
Mostly wrong. That was an easy one. I saw that you got actually badmouthed by somebody named Lynn Schaefer. And this was, I don't know if you read that. Did you read? I think it was masking, where basically she said you didn't know what you were talking about with regard to masking. When people come out and write op-eds or say something that you know is just like, you know the science, right? You're not a science writer. You actually know the science. You're actually looking at the studies. You are in it every single day of your life. Again, when you see stuff like that, you just get pissed. I mean, talk to us about the human side, because you still got to go to work and you still have to live and you still have a family and it still affects you, right? You're still a human being.
I guess, to be perfectly honest with you, not only do I not know who that person is, I never read anything that they wrote. And so, I mean, not to sound, that's fine. No, but I mean, I think there's one point to be made, which is that, anytime you take any public stance, there's going to be a million people in the peanut gallery talking about you. I always preferred in the pandemic to focus on the issues and make my arguments there and not the people. But so this person I don't know, but your question was like, does it bother you when people disagree? To me, I
disagree, but when they go after you, you're like really, really personal, as opposed to attacking the issue or attacking the argument or attacking the evidence.
Yeah, I guess I do think that one of the reasons I bother them more than other people who said what I said is because I'm harder to attack for the personal. Not to toot my own horn here, but when I was in my late 30s, I was promoted to full professor. I've written 2 books. I have 500 research publications. My papers are heavily cited. So it's difficult to say that this guy doesn't know epidemiology. That's a difficult claim to make. And if people listen to me and watch my videos, they'll say, it's difficult to believe he doesn't know what he's talking about. So I think that kind of person makes you more angry and harder to deal with. Now, what I would say is that, of course, I think that I don't like. I'm happy to read like a thoughtful criticism of my argument, but I'm not that interested in reading why I shouldn't be talking about it. One of the things I was told was that, he's not a pediatrician, so how would he know whether or not masks work in kids? I was like, well, I'm an expert in reading clinical studies, and I'm not an idiot. And if you're not an idiot, you would know that a 2-year-old, it's not going to work in 2-year-old, right? So you don't really need to be, if you really have to go to be a pediatrician to know a cloth mask doesn't work in a 2-year-old, I question a lot about our education system, right? So I think a lot of people don't like these ad hominem arguments. Yeah,
exactly. When you talked about Dr. Hotez, the reason why I bring him back up again is I hope this is just a stupid rumor, but somebody suggested that he might be taking over Dr. Fauci's job at some point because of all these awards. Please tell me that's not going to happen, right?
Well, they appointed someone else for the NIAID director.
Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, you asked about what Hotez got wrong. Hotez got school closure wrong, masking kids wrong, vaccine mandates wrong. Robert F. Kennedy famously wanted to debate him, and he said that I won't debate RFK Jr. because it's beneath me. But I said that, I worry he can't debate RFK Jr. because even though I think RFK Jr. says a lot of things that are also wrong, RFK Jr. will mop the floor with him in a debate, because how can you enter a policy debate having supported some of these policies, school closure, that leaves you very vulnerable. Yeah.
Yeah, and also their positions are basically, they're not moving from their position. So
yeah, they're not moving.
I don't even like the word debate, just having a discussion. So like you could actually sit there and have a discussion and talk about it. Right. So
with either one.
You look at Dr. Malone, right? Like you obviously didn't agree with everything Dr. Malone said, I don't think.
Yeah, I wrote a piece on that. Yeah.
Right. But there were things that you did agree with him on. And I think it would be interesting for you guys to have a discussion where somebody like him would say, well, it's beneath me, right? It's beneath me because I know so much. And because, again, name calling, right? Fringe epidemiologist. Which is really, really sad that that's where we've gotten, right? But do you see any hope? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Are you seeing any difference now with regard to just skepticism and conversation, talking with your colleagues?
I think the reality of what I'm seeing is that, like some people ask me, like, are you going to write a book on COVID-19 policy? And it's the same thing and the answer is not yet. And here's why. The reality is I just think people don't want to talk about it right now. Like, from what I'm seeing, like the students don't want to talk about it. The faculty don't want to talk about it. I think people increasingly feel like we got some things wrong, but they're not ready to hear it. They need a little breather. Maybe in 5 years or 10 years, they'll want a book that sets the record straight. I I'm happy to do other people. You know who I want to do about who got what they got right wrong? I want to do Donald Trump.
Okay, so that's an interesting one because the Trump lovers get this wrong, right?
Yeah.
I was asked when I wasn't vaccinated here in Canada, a guy says to me, "Oh, what are you, a Trumper?" And I'm like, well, he was pushing the vaccine early on, right? And he's not anti-vax. So, yeah, I mean, everybody assumes that because he wasn't around, because it was Biden's been around for the last 4 years, 3.5, that Trump got it right, or he would have got it right. But there's no evidence of that, is there? Or
yeah, so I mean, that's interesting. So here's how I'll go through his stuff. So one is, I think when they initially got reports that there was a pandemic spreading in Wuhan, I think their administration was very slow to respond in January, February. 2, I think a mistake he made was listening to Fauci so heavily. That did backfire. 3, I think he probably was more right about masks than anyone else. I mean, he didn't want to wear one, and he knows that didn't do much, and he also saw the hypocrisy, like people putting on TV and not off. He was probably more right than everyone else about school reopening. He was right about that in July. He was right, I think, about Operation Warp Speed, like to launch Operation Warp Speed. I think that did save lives. I think he was right that the clinical trial of Pfizer changed the primary look at the data to put the vaccine after Election Day just to subvert him. I think he was right about that. I think had he been president, he might have implemented vaccine mandates. I don't know or not. He was very much in support of vaccine mandates. One thing I think he got wrong, and the biggest reason I think, people view him as someone who got COVID wrong, was that I think he didn't have his finger on the pulse of people were very, very scared in 2020 in the first half. And when he talked about it, it was often very erratic and dismissive, so much so that people really worried that we didn't have control of the situation. And to a large degree, the answer was that, unfortunately, the horse had left the barn and you were not going to be able to stop global spread of the virus, and it was too little too late. But I think that, a lot of his actions certainly undermined the faith and credibility of the population. And he did get, many things wrong where he made passive, offhanded comments about bleach and light and these things. And people say he didn't. People. Some purists say he didn't actually say to do it. Yeah, I know he didn't actually say to do it, but I don't think the president should be just like freewheeling it. Just spitballing ideas when people are like panicking and on the national TV. Yeah. So I mean, I think those are things he got wrong. Yeah.
Well, he riffs on everything. So hey, why not riff on medicine and science, right?
That's what it was. It's riffing. Yeah, it's riffing.
Up here, Dr. Tam, what do you know about her? Is she credible?
My understanding is
she's our Dr. Fauci.
She's an extremely pro-mask person, right? So she's wrong about that. Mm-hmm. And she's similar to Fauci in sort of policy positions. I think she's wrong, mostly.
So depressing sometimes. It is, because you said something about 10, 15 minutes ago about people are getting tired of it. We want to get over it. But then there's people who we don't want to talk about it anymore because they were wrong.
Yeah. So who's mostly right people? Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Kohlsdorf, Scott Atlas, Johann Jezecki, Anders Tegnell, mostly right. Steph Burrell from Johns Hopkins, Marty Macri from Johns Hopkins, mostly right. I think John Ioannidis from Stanford, I think, got a lot of things right and was kind of pushed aside.
How many of these people are still kind of pushed out? Like Dr. Kohlsdorf, I mean, he's out of a job, right?
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Maybe we should talk about that for a second.
Yeah, go ahead, because that's real. I mean, it leads to censorship and cancellation. This is a disgrace. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, first of all, I think Martin was a very brave person, and he said a lot of points early on that took people a lot of years to figure out, and I think he was very wise. Now, my understanding was he was pushed out of a few things. He was on the CDC Advisory Committee for vaccination, but when he expressed concerns that we should focus vaccination on the elderly and not young children, they pushed him out for that. That's a big problem. That, I think, is a real cancellation that has to do with viewpoint censorship. The reason he was fired was that I think nominally he was an employee of the Harvard hospital system, and the Harvard hospital system had a vaccine mandate, and he had already had COVID and recovered. He didn't want to get vaccinated, and so they fired him as a result. Okay. So here's a few thoughts. One is, I don't think they strictly did it because of his views. I think they did it because of the mandate. 2, I do think that had it been somebody who they liked a lot more, they might have found a way to keep him on and make an exemption for him, which they did for lots of people, right? So it's easy to not make exemptions for people you don't like. Three, I think that, I faced the same situation. I didn't want to get a booster. I didn't want to get dose 2. I did want to get dose 1. I'm happy to talk more about that, why I wanted dose 1, but not the others. But I was about to be fired, and I just swallowed a bunch of Advil and took the dose because I'm like, whatever. I don't want to lose my job over this. I agree it's not good for me. I don't think it's a net positive for me to get dose 2 and 3, but I don't want to lose my job over it. I want to live to fight another day. Back to Martin. Okay, so he lost his job. Some people defend that and say, look, our policy was our policy. And, but what I want to say is that even if you're a believer in vaccine mandates, and even if you say the history of vaccination had mandates, do you really think termination of employment should be the punishment? Because in the old days, you would get a vaccine mandate, but if you didn't do it, you get a $150 fine. I think the punishment has to also be proportionate to the evidence. And being terminated from employment and not being allowed to get employment in the same sector, like most doctors, that's a professional death sentence. That is not commensurate with the mandate, even if you believe in mandates, which I don't, which I think this should not be mandated. So to me, even the proponents cannot justify him being fired. And then finally, why can't they hire him back now? Show some humility and admit you got it wrong. I think Aaron Coretti is another one who's fired wrongly, and University of California, Irvine, he should go back. So that to me is a problem, yeah.
Yeah, what ended up happening up here with a lot of the colleges is if you didn't want to get the vaccination, I had colleagues who tried to get exemptions. They didn't care. They don't want to see it. Well, why does it exist then? Why does the process of an exemption exist if you're not giving it to anyone?
Right.
So what they ended up doing is with the part-timers, they let all their contracts basically just expire, meaning they're fired. But then it was funny because as this was going on, Omicron starts and everybody is getting it. So everyone that's vaccinated is getting Omicron and they're all sick. So there was no, guys, we got it wrong. You can come back. Instead, all they did was they just offered everybody a contract again with no explanation. So they hired everybody back with no explanation. It was kind of a weaselly way of doing it, right? Because they didn't want to admit they were wrong and that you didn't need the vax. So they just said, oh yeah, by the way, do you want to teach in September?
I see. And
this goes back to something Christopher Hitchens talked about a long time ago when he talked about censorship. It wasn't the state in a lot of cases basically coming down on people. It was your neighbor. It was your neighbor at the golf course, being the nasty hall monitor. It was your teacher. It was your coworker. It was a relative disinviting you to
well, I'll give you
meals.
some examples of that. I have some colleagues, and I have a colleague who has like an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old, healthy children. And the colleague says, the colleague vaccinates the children for COVID-19, which I wouldn't have advised, but whatever. If they want to do it, fine. Then the colleague says, well, we can't go visit my parents this year. I say, why not? Like, well, my parents didn't want to get vaccinated. And I'm like, you're vaccinated, your kids, who cares? And they're like, well, I don't want them to spread it to us. I was like, somebody can spread it to you in Whole Foods. What the hell are you talking about? So here is a person who's supposed to be a doctor and smart, using this as a they stigmatize the person so much. It's saying that the grandparent cannot see the grandchild for not getting a medical intervention that has no effect on anyone other than the grandparent. That to me is such a fundamentally broken morality. It's immoral. It's a broken medical calculation. It's a broken science. It speaks to just totally broken. Another example, I had a friend who his girlfriend is in her 30s. She's healthy. She refused to see her parents for Christmas because they didn't want to get vaccinated. Again, to me, like, you're dividing families over this, and it's complete nonsense. And then I asked, why? What are you worried about? Oh, I don't know. They don't have an explanation.
To me, like, have a reason.
They never have a reason.
It's
never really articulated really well to me.
Especially when you say you have to, get it. This was the one that killed me the most. So it's like, you have to get it. This thing is going to stop the transmission. This thing is great. And it's going to save you. So then why do I need to take it then? You're taking it, aren't you?
Oh, so that's one point, is that if it's so good for you to get it, then what's the additional benefit compelling me? That's a fair point. Yeah, exactly. That's a fair argument. Yeah. They never had an answer to that.
No. Well, listen, you've been doing great work. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. I was it got me through COVID, actually, listening, because we're at home, can't talk to colleagues. So going on YouTube, listening to you, Dr. Bhattacharya, listening to Jimmy Dore talking about it, listening to RFK, different people coming at it from different points of view. It got me through like a year and a half of COVID. So I really, really appreciate everything you've done. Keep fighting the good fight. I know that they do what the tricks they're playing on you on YouTube. Just today, I'm putting your name in. Sometimes it just automatically fills in the rest. And today you were like the 7th person with, and these guys were coming up with names that weren't even similar to yours. So they're shadow banning people. We know that, right? So
and every time I put a video on this topic, at the bottom they say, if you want accurate information, look at the CDC website, which is that's the last place. So I didn't say this, but we have a whole paper documenting their statistical and numerical errors. They can't even count correctly, like the number of dead children. So I think to defer to their authority is crazy. I would never do so. Yeah. Well, thank you for doing this interview. I appreciate your time.
No, this was fantastic. You take care, be healthy, and keep doing good work.
Thank you.